The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl lift a sealed container in a bunker, and the message inside could doom a city. I think the city is in danger. The little girl whispered, her voice barely audible as she stood beside Jake, her eyes fixed on the sealed container they had just opened. Jake didn't respond right away, his mind racing as he processed the cryptic message he had just read on the letter inside. What did this mean? Was someone really planning to destroy the city? He glanced down at the girl, her small hands still clutching the edge of the metal container as if she was afraid to let go. We need to leave now, Jake said firmly, pulling her gently away from the bunker. He could feel a cold shiver running down his spine, a sense of unease crawling through his veins. The words in that letter, the symbols, everything about it felt wrong. He had spent years being part of a brotherhood that thrived on secrecy, violence, and loyalty, but this was something entirely different. He glanced around, scanning the empty road. The eerie silence hung heavy in the air, as if the world was holding its breath. The girl's eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion, but she didn't protest as Jake guided her back toward his Harley. The snow was starting to fall heavier now, blanketing the ground with a soft, white layer. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, a simple ride along a familiar road, but it had turned into something much more dangerous. Something that could change everything. What do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake sighed, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted the straps of his helmet. We figure out who's behind this and stop it before it's too late. He swung his leg over his bike and started it up, the familiar roar of the engine filling the air. The girl hesitated for a moment, then climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Jake could feel her trembling against his back, her small body pressing against his. He knew that this was no longer just about him. This was about her, too. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Not now. Not when she was the key to uncovering whatever dark plot was unfolding. As they sped off down the road, Jake's mind raced. The letter had been clear. The message inside the container wasn't just a warning. It was a call to action, a map of sorts, leading them somewhere. But where? And why was it so important? Whoever had hidden that container clearly knew something that Jake didn't, something he needed to find out. The girl's soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Do you think they'll come after us? She asked, her voice laced with worry. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. I don't know, he replied honestly. But we can't just sit around and wait for them to make the next move. We need to figure this out, and we need to do it fast. As they drove further into the night, the storm continued to rage around them. The wind howled, pushing against them, but Jake pushed forward, determination burning in his chest. The girl, her head buried against his back, seemed to find comfort in his steady movement. But Jake knew that the real danger was still ahead. Whoever had hidden that container wasn't going to give up easily, and they would do anything to keep their secret safe. The road stretched on endlessly, winding through the dark and desolate landscape. Jake's thoughts kept circling back to the letter. The symbols, the map, the warning, it was all too much to process at once. But one thing was clear. Whatever was inside that bunker had the power to bring the city to its knees. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. As they reached a small, abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town, Jake slowed the bike and pulled over. The place was dark, the windows boarded up, the sign flickering weakly in the storm's fury. It wasn't much, but it was a place to regroup, to think. Jake parked the bike and turned off the engine, the quiet now wrapping around them like a blanket. The girl slid off the back of the bike, her boots crunching in the snow as she walked over to the gas station's door, pushing it open with a creak. We need to call someone, she said, her voice shaky. Someone who can help us figure out what to do. Jake nodded, but as he walked toward the door to join her, he felt something cold settle in his gut. This wasn't just a coincidence. There was something bigger at play here, something that could destroy everything. And they were right in the middle of it. I know they're looking for us, Jake said as he paced back and forth in the dim light of the abandoned gas station. The storm outside had only gotten worse, the wind howling like a creature in pain, rattling the old windows and making the building feel like it might cave in at any moment. The girl, Emma, sat on an old chair in the corner, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Jake could tell that she was scared, though she tried to hide it. He felt the same way. Whatever they had uncovered in that bunker was far bigger than either of them could have imagined. We can't stay here long, he muttered, wiping the wet hair from his face. He'd been trying to figure out their next move, but the message inside the container, the symbols, the warning, it was all too much to process. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "What do we do now?" Emma asked softly, her voice barely cutting through the thick silence of the room. Jake turned toward her, meeting her gaze for a moment before looking away, his eyes searching the dark corners of the gas station. "We figure out who's behind this," he said, his voice hardening with determination. "And we stop them. Whatever they're planning, we have to stop it before it's too late." Emma nodded slowly, though Jake could see that she wasn't convinced. She had no idea what they were up against, and he didn't know how to explain it to her. But he couldn't afford to worry about that now. He had to focus on the bigger picture. He couldn't let her get caught up in this. Not like this. He was about to speak again when the sound of a motorcycle engine broke through the storm outside. The deep rumble of an engine getting closer. Jake tensed, his muscles locking up instinctively. He quickly grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her toward the back of the gas station, toward the small storage area that led to the alley behind. "Stay quiet, stay hidden," he whispered urgently. He could hear the footsteps outside now, heavy boots crunching on the snow. They were here. Whoever was behind this, they had found them. Jake's heart raced, his instincts kicking in. He pressed himself against the cold concrete wall of the storage area, listening carefully. The door to the gas station creaked open, and a voice echoed in from the outside. "The place is empty," the voice said, low and menacing. Jake's hand tightened around the handle of his knife. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Whoever these people were, they weren't here to make friends. "Check the back," another voice ordered, sharper this time. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jake glanced at Emma, her wide eyes reflecting the same fear he was feeling. "We need to get out of here now," he whispered. There was no time to think. They had to move before they were trapped. He grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the back door, but just as he reached for the handle, the door swung open. A man in a leather jacket stepped through, his face hidden behind a dark helmet. His eyes glinted with a cold, calculating look as they met Jake's. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just dealing with ordinary thugs. These people knew what they were doing, and they had found them. The man took a step forward, his voice cold and demanding. "I know you have the container. Hand it over." Jake didn't answer right away. He was sizing the man up, trying to figure out his next move. He had to think fast. The last thing he wanted was for Emma to get hurt. He could feel the weight of her small hand in his, the fear in her grip. He had to protect her. "You're not getting it," Jake said slowly, his voice low and dangerous. The man didn't flinch. He was used to getting what he wanted. "You don't have a choice," the man said. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your call." Jake's mind raced. There was no way out. They were outnumbered, and the bunker had already tipped them off. This was just the beginning. He knew they couldn't run forever. They had to face whoever these people were, and they had to do it now. Without warning, Jake pulled Emma behind him, stepping forward. "I'm not handing anything over," he said firmly. The man's expression hardened, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "Last chance," he warned. Jake took a deep breath, his muscles tensing. He was ready to fight if he had to, but he didn't want to. Not like this. Not with Emma there. Then, before Jake could move, the man suddenly lunged at him, but Jake was faster. In one swift motion, he dodged and knocked the man to the ground, his fists slamming into the man's jaw. The man grunted in pain, but he wasn't down for long. He scrambled to his feet, pulling out a knife, and lunged at Jake again. But this time, Jake was ready. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it and disarming him in one fluid motion. The knife fell to the ground with a loud clatter, and Jake kicked it out of reach. "Get up," Jake growled, his eyes locked on the man's. "Get out of here before I make you." The man didn't argue. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes flashing with anger, but he didn't try to fight again. He backed away slowly, his hands raised in defeat. "This isn't over," the man hissed. "We'll be back." With that, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the storm. Jake let out a long breath, his body tense with adrenaline. He didn't like what had just happened. Not one bit. But they had survived. "For now, let's go," Jake said, grabbing Emma's hand once more. They couldn't stay here any longer. The storm was still raging outside, but it wasn't the weather that had Jake worried now. It was the threat that was still out there. Whoever had been after them, they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. And Jake wasn't about to let that happen. I can't believe they just let us go, Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she sat in the back of Jake's Harley, still trying to process what had just happened. The man they had confronted at the gas station had left, but the tension in the air felt far from over. Jake gripped the handlebars of the bike tightly, his eyes focused ahead as the wind howled around them. "Don't get comfortable," Jake said, his voice low and steady, though there was an unmistakable edge of worry in it. "They won't stop looking for us. Whoever they are, they want that container. And they're not the kind of people who just give up." Emma shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her small frame. She was scared, and she had every right to be. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was brewing over their heads. They had no idea who the men were or what they wanted, but it was clear they were after something far bigger than they were willing to admit. Jake's mind raced as they continued down the snowy highway, the tires of the Harley crunching over the packed snow. The silence between them was thick, but it was the kind of silence that needed to be filled. Do you think it's connected to what's in the city?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "What's in the city?" Jake repeated, glancing over his shoulder to catch her eye. "The message in the container. You read it. You saw the map, right?" Emma pressed on, her voice growing more desperate. "Is it really that bad? Could it really happen?" Jake felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had promised himself he wouldn't let her get caught up in this, but it was becoming clear that she was already in deeper than anyone could have imagined. "I don't know," Jake admitted, his eyes darkening. "But I know one thing for sure, we can't let it happen. Whatever that message was about, it's not just a warning. It's a plan." The wind picked up again, and Jake leaned into the handlebars, his mind flashing back to the container, to the cryptic letter, and the mysterious symbols that had been etched onto the map. He could still see them clearly in his mind, the red areas marked on the city map, the dangerous parts of town that no one ever talked about. He knew there were powerful forces at play, but he wasn't sure who they were or what their endgame was. But one thing was becoming more and more certain. They couldn't keep running. They had to face whatever was coming head-on. The city was at risk, and they were the only ones who knew about it. "We need to get to the bottom of this," Jake said, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "And we need to do it before they come for us again." Emma nodded, her face pale but determined. "But how?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How do we even begin to stop something that big?" Jake didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know where to start or who to trust, but he knew that time was running out. As the storm raged around them, the city loomed in the distance, its lights twinkling like stars. It was a city full of secrets, full of corruption and danger. And Jake was about to find out just how deep those secrets ran. They rode in silence for a while longer, the only sounds the roar of the engine and the wind whipping through the night. Jake was lost in thought, his mind spinning with possibilities. He had to find out who was behind all of this. He had to figure out what they wanted and why they were willing to go to such lengths to keep their plans hidden. But more than anything, he had to protect Emma. She had no idea what kind of danger she was in, but Jake knew that the stakes were higher than anything they had faced before. They were in over their heads, but there was no turning back now. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He had a plan, but it wasn't much of one. They were about to step into the lion's den, and he wasn't sure what would happen next. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, they would face it together. "Hold on tight," Jake said to Emma as he pulled the bike into a small, dark alleyway. "This is where it gets messy." Emma gripped him tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was coming, but she trusted Jake. And in that moment, that was enough. The city loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. And Jake knew that their journey was only just beginning. "I'm telling you, this is the right place," Jake muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the dark alleyway ahead of him. He could feel the tension rising in his chest, the anticipation of what was to come gnawing at him. The plan was simple enough. Get inside the city, find the source of the threat, and figure out who was behind it all. But nothing was ever simple when it came to danger. Nothing was ever straightforward. Emma was still clutching him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his waist as they rode through the deserted streets. She was quiet now, but Jake could feel the weight of her fear pressing against him. He wanted to reassure her, tell her that everything would be okay, but he wasn't sure if he believed that himself. This city, with its towering buildings and dark corners, was a place of secrets, secrets that Jake had only begun to scratch the surface of. The kind of secrets that people would kill to protect. As they rounded the corner, Jake spotted the building he'd been looking for, a nondescript warehouse tucked away in the heart of the city. The kind of place that screamed danger without saying a word. The windows were dark, the doors reinforced with heavy metal locks, and there was an air of tension around it, like it was hiding something. Maybe it was. Maybe this was where everything would make sense. Jake pulled the bike to a stop a few yards away, his boots scraping against the pavement as he dismounted. He could feel Emma shifting behind him, her hands tightening their grip around his jacket. "We're here," Jake said, his voice low. He glanced over his shoulder at Emma, his gaze softening just for a moment. "Stay close. Don't make any noise unless I say so." She nodded, though Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He couldn't blame her. This wasn't the kind of place you brought a kid to. But there was no other choice. If they were going to stop this, they had to face it head on. Jake moved toward the building, his steps calculated and silent. The storm had died down, but the air still felt thick with tension, like something bad was about to happen. He reached the door and paused, his hand hovering over the handle. For a moment, he considered turning back. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when they were this close. He pushed the door open, the rusty hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the warehouse was as empty and cold as it looked on the outside. But there was something different about it. Jake's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, noting the shadows in the corners and the faint traces of dust on the floor. Whoever had been here recently had been careful. Too careful. He stepped inside, pulling Emma close to his side. The floor was concrete, cold beneath his boots, and the air smelled like old metal and decay. There was a faint light at the far end of the room, and Jake's instincts told him to move toward it. Every step was calculated, every sound amplified in the stillness. He had to be careful. They weren't alone. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible. Jake froze, his senses on high alert. There was a low hum, almost like the sound of machinery. He didn't have to hear it for long before the light in the corner flickered on, casting a pale glow across the room. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Standing in front of him, surrounded by crates and old equipment, was a figure, a man in a suit, his face partially obscured by shadows. Jake's hand instinctively went to the gun tucked into his waistband, but the man held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man said, his voice smooth and calm. Jake didn't say anything, his gaze hardening. He had no idea who this guy was, but he wasn't about to trust him. Not yet. "Who are you?" Jake growled. "And what do you know about the container?" The man smiled, a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "You're looking for answers, I can tell," he said. "But the real question is, are you ready to hear them?" Jake's grip on his gun tightened. He wasn't sure what this man knew, but if it was anything like the information inside that container, it wasn't going to be good. "I don't have time for games," Jake snapped. "I'm not here to play. I'm here to stop whatever's happening. Now tell me what you know." The man's smile faded, and he stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "You think you're here to stop something?" "No, Jake. You're here to finish something." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. "Finish what?" Jake demanded. "You're not looking for a way out," the man continued. "You're looking for a way to end it. And you're not the only one who wants that." Jake took a step back, his mind racing. What the hell was this guy talking about? Before he could react, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, and another figure appeared in the doorway. This one was bigger, more menacing. The second figure stepped into the light, revealing a face that was both familiar and terrifying. Jake's heart skipped again, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was recognition. The man standing in front of him wasn't a stranger. It was someone from his past, a past he had hoped to forget. And now, standing before him, the man was ready to finish what they had started. The stakes had just been raised, and Jake realized that everything he thought he knew had just changed. "I didn't expect to see you again, Jake." The voice was smooth, low, and familiar, sending a chill through his spine. Jake didn't move for a moment, his eyes locked on the man who had just stepped forward into the light. It was him, the man from his past, the one who had once been a friend, or at least someone who had pretended to be. Now, there was nothing friendly about the cold stare coming from the man's eyes. "What do you want?" Jake growled, his hand tightening on the grip of his gun, though he kept it low for now. He wasn't sure if he should be angry or just frustrated. But the fact that the man standing in front of him was tied to whatever had gone wrong in his life made his blood boil. "You really think you can stop this, Jake?" The man's voice didn't carry any hint of concern. He sounded almost amused, as if Jake was a child playing a dangerous game. "You've been running from this for years, but it's time to face it." The air in the warehouse suddenly felt heavier, suffocating even, as the tension rose. Jake wasn't sure what to do next. The last time they had crossed paths, things had ended in chaos. Their friendship had ended the moment Jake had left the gang, abandoning the life of violence, deceit, and destruction they had built together. But it seemed that the man standing in front of him had never left that life behind. "I'm not the same person I used to be," Jake said, his voice steady but firm. "And I'm not running from anything anymore. You're the one who needs to explain yourself." The man chuckled darkly, his eyes gleaming with something sinister. "Oh, I don't need to explain anything to you, Jake. Not anymore. You're in over your head now." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his grip tightening on the gun. He wasn't going to be manipulated again. He had learned from his past mistakes. "You're too late," the man replied, stepping closer. "The plan is already set into motion. And now, there's no turning back." Jake's heart raced. He had no idea what the man was talking about, but he could feel the danger in his words. The same danger that had once driven him into the arms of the Hells Angels. The same danger that had ruined everything he had tried to build. Emma's small voice broke through the tension, shaking and uncertain. "Jake, who is this?" she asked, her eyes wide as she looked from Jake to the man. Jake glanced at her, his mind racing. She had no idea what she was in the middle of. She was just a kid, but she was already caught in this mess. He didn't want her to see the ugliness of his past. He had kept her safe up until now, but this man, he was a reminder of the life Jake had left behind, the life he had sworn never to return to. "He's someone I used to know," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Someone who's made a lot of bad decisions. And now, we're paying for them." The man smirked at Jake's words. "Oh, Jake," he said mockingly. "You really think this is about you? This isn't about you, or me, or even her. This is about power, about control, about making sure nothing gets in the way of what's coming." Jake didn't like the sound of that. The man was talking in riddles, but the meaning was clear enough. Whatever was coming, it was bad, and Jake had to stop it. He stepped forward, ignoring the man's smug expression. "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded. "What's coming?" The man paused for a moment, his eyes flickering with something like hesitation, but only for a split second. Then his face hardened again. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "You think you're some kind of hero, Jake? That you're going to save the day? It doesn't work that way. This isn't a movie. This is real life, and people like you and me, we're just pawns in a much bigger game." Jake's mind was racing. The man's words made no sense, but they also felt too familiar. He had been a pawn once. He had been used, manipulated, and tossed aside. But he wasn't going to let that happen again. He had a responsibility now, to Emma, to himself, and to the people who didn't even know they were in danger. "This ends now," Jake said firmly, his eyes narrowing. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends with you." The man's smirk faded slightly, but he didn't back down. "You think you can stop this?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You can't even stop me. And I'm just a messenger." Jake's blood ran cold. A messenger? What was he talking about? Before Jake could react, the door behind him slammed open, and two more figures entered the warehouse. They were dressed in black, their faces hidden by masks. One of them stepped forward, their eyes locked onto Jake with a cold intensity. "You shouldn't have come here, Jake," the new figure said, their voice low and dangerous. "Now you're going to regret it." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had a bad feeling about this. And before he could even react, the man who had spoken to him earlier nodded, signaling to the two newcomers. They moved in sync, their movements precise and calculated. Jake didn't have time to think. His instincts took over as he moved to protect Emma, pulling her behind him and readying himself for the fight. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. He had made that promise. He wasn't going to break it now. "Stay behind me, Emma," Jake ordered, his voice low and steady. She nodded, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She had no idea what was going on, but she trusted him. And that trust was something he wasn't going to let go of. As the two men moved closer, Jake could feel the weight of everything on his shoulders. The city was in danger, and he was the only one who could stop it. But it wasn't going to be easy. And now, there was no turning back. "I can't do this," Emma whispered, her voice shaky as she clutched onto Jake's jacket. The tension in the room had escalated quickly, and the two masked figures were getting closer. The sound of their heavy boots on the concrete floor made her heart pound in her chest. Jake could feel her fear radiating through him, but he wasn't about to let her see him flinch. He needed to stay strong, not just for himself, but for her too. "Stay behind me," Jake said, his voice steady, even as his pulse quickened. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting to protect Emma, to stop whatever was coming, and to uncover the truth behind everything that had been set into motion. The masked figures took another step forward. One of them reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek black gun. The other man stood by, watching closely, his eyes never leaving Jake. Emma's grip tightened around Jake's waist, and he could hear her barely suppressed sobs. "You don't have to be scared," Jake said, glancing over his shoulder at her. "I won't let them hurt you." The words came out more confidently than he felt. He had to make her believe it. He had to make himself believe it. The man holding the gun took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "You should have stayed out of this, Jake," the figure said, his voice cold and low. "But now that you're involved, there's no going back." Jake's mind raced. These men weren't just random thugs. They were part of something much bigger, something with resources, power, and a plan that was already unfolding. The city was in danger, and he knew he had to stop it. "I'm not afraid of you," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can intimidate me? I've dealt with worse than you." The man's lips curled into a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You really don't get it, do you?" he asked. "This isn't about you and me. This is about something far bigger than either of us. And you're in the way." Before Jake could respond, the man raised his gun, pointing it directly at him. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, but there was hesitation in his eyes. Jake didn't know what it meant, but he wasn't about to wait around and find out. He moved in a flash, lunging forward and grabbing the man's wrist, twisting it with a sharp twist that made the man grunt. In pain, the gun fell to the floor with a loud clatter, and Jake kicked it away, sending it sliding across the room. The second man moved toward him quickly, reaching for a knife hidden in his belt, but Jake was already prepared. He ducked low, avoiding the knife's swing, and slammed his elbow into the man's stomach. The figure staggered back, gasping for air. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man by the collar, yanking him forward and slamming his fist into the man's face. The punch sent him crashing into a stack of crates, and he crumpled to the floor. Jake turned back to the first man, who was now on his feet again, his eyes burning with rage. But Jake wasn't going to let him take control. He took a step toward him, his movements precise and calculated. "You're done," Jake said, his voice low. "You've made your choice. Now deal with the consequences." The man's eyes flickered, as if weighing his options, but before he could make a move, the door to the warehouse suddenly slammed open. A group of figures entered, their silhouettes barely visible in the harsh light from the storm outside. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. There were more of them, and they weren't here to talk. The first man smirked, his stance relaxed as the reinforcements filed in. "I told you it was too late, Jake," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "This is just the beginning. You should have walked away when you had the chance." Jake's mind raced. The odds were stacked against him, but he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. He couldn't let them win. Emma needed him. The city needed him. And whatever these people were planning, it was going to stop here. The reinforcements moved in, surrounding Jake on all sides, but he could feel his resolve harden. "You think you can scare me?" Jake said, his voice a low growl. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." The man who had been holding the gun earlier stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "But before this is over, you're going to wish you never crossed us." Jake clenched his fists, his body tense and ready. He wasn't going down without a fight. "If you want to fight, you've got it," Jake said, his voice steady. "But this ends tonight." He glanced over at Emma, who was standing behind him, her face pale but determined. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew enough to know that Jake wasn't backing down. They weren't leaving until they got answers. They weren't leaving until this was over. I know what you're trying to do, Jake said, his voice low and steady as the group of reinforcements slowly closed in on him. They circled around him like predators, but Jake wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of showing fear. The sound of their boots scraping against the concrete echoed in the otherwise silent warehouse. His mind was racing, calculating his next move. He wasn't outnumbered yet, but it was clear they were getting ready to overwhelm him. Emma was standing behind him, her small figure almost lost in the shadows of the room. She had no idea what was going on, but Jake could feel her gripping the back of his jacket, her fingers trembling with fear. It wasn't just the danger they were facing now. It was the weight of the situation. If they didn't make it out of here, everything they had worked for would be lost. I'm not afraid of you, Jake continued, his tone unwavering, though his eyes never left the men in front of him. Whatever you think you're going to do, it's not going to work. The leader of the group, the one who had been speaking earlier, stepped forward, his face still obscured by a dark mask. You really don't get it, do you? He said, his voice calm, but with an edge of menace. This isn't about you being afraid. It's about the fact that you're too late. You're trying to stop something that's already in motion. Jake took a step forward, his posture tense, his fists clenched. What is it you're trying to do? He asked, his voice hard. What's your endgame? The man smirked, as if Jake's question was beneath him. You think you can just come in here, start asking questions, and get answers? He chuckled softly. This isn't a game, Jake. You're already in over your head. Jake's eyes flickered to the side, where the exit lay just beyond the group. There was no way out. Not without a fight. The man continued, pacing slowly around him, his eyes never leaving Jake. You've seen the map, right? The man asked, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge. You've seen where it leads. What's coming? What's been planned for this city? You're just a small part of it. You can't stop it. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the man's words hit home. It wasn't just about the container. It wasn't just about the mysterious map or the cryptic symbols. There was something bigger going on. And Jake was in the middle of it. He wasn't just a bystander. He was part of something far darker than he had realized. You're wrong, Jake said, his voice firm, his anger building. I'm not just a part of it. I'm going to stop it. Whatever it is you're planning, I'll make sure it doesn't happen. The man laughed again, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the empty space. You're going to try, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But you're not going to succeed. You're too weak, too insignificant. Jake wasn't about to back down. He stepped closer to the man, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with determination. You're wrong about that too, Jake growled. I'm not weak, and I'll make sure you don't get away with whatever you're planning. Before the man could respond, a loud noise came from behind them. The door to the warehouse slammed open, and a group of new figures entered, their boots stomping on the floor as they made their way toward Jake and Emma. Jake's instincts kicked in immediately, and he turned his body to shield Emma, moving her behind him. His fingers twitched toward the knife in his belt, but he kept his movements calm, calculating. The new figures were dressed in black, their faces covered with masks. They weren't here to talk. They were here to end this. Jake Morrison, one of them said, his voice deep and menacing. You're in the way. The leader of the original group stepped back, allowing the newcomers to take over. Take him out, the man said coldly. Without warning, the new group rushed toward Jake, their movements synchronized. Jake didn't have time to think. His training kicked in, and he moved with precision, ducking under the first attack, dodging a punch, and countering with a strike to the side of one of the men's ribs. The man grunted in pain, stumbling back, but Jake didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was fighting for his life, for Emma's life, for the city that was at the mercy of whatever these people were planning. The fight was chaotic, fast-paced, with punches landing, bodies colliding, and the sound of grunts and growls filling the air. Jake was faster, more agile than they expected, but there were too many of them. He was starting to feel the strain, his muscles aching with every move. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Emma, Jake called over his shoulder, his voice strained. Stay down. Don't move. Emma nodded quickly, her eyes wide with fear, but she listened. She knew enough to stay out of the way. The fight raged on, and Jake could feel his energy waning. His movements were slower now, more deliberate. The men were relentless, and the more they fought, the more Jake realized that they weren't trying to win. They were wearing him down. But Jake wasn't done yet. He wouldn't be until he found out the truth. You think this is going to stop me? Jake growled through gritted teeth as he knocked another man to the ground. You're wrong. You'll never stop me. The man closest to him sneered, his eyes full of contempt. You're just one man, he spat. And you'll never change what's coming. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the weight of their words. But as the fight continued, something clicked inside of him. This wasn't just about stopping them. It was about stopping everything they represented. He wasn't going to let them win. He wouldn't let them control everything. Not on his watch. I can't do this alone, Jake muttered under his breath, his voice filled with frustration as the fight raged on. His body ached, bruised from the blows he had already taken, but his mind remained focused. The men were relentless, each one skilled and quick, pushing him to his limits. But there was something different this time. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting to protect Emma, to stop whatever dark plan had been set into motion. He had no idea how many more of them there were, but with every strike, it became clearer that they weren't just here to stop him. They were here to make sure nothing stopped them. The room was filled with the sounds of grunts, the clash of fists on flesh, and the sharp sting of metal against concrete. Jake's movements were slower now, his energy wearing thin as the fight dragged on. But Emma was behind him, safe, for now, and that thought kept him going. His knuckles bled, his vision blurred slightly from the impact of multiple hits to his head, but Jake refused to go down. He couldn't afford to. Not when the stakes were this high. One of the men lunged forward, a flash of steel in his hand. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he sidestepped just in time, grabbing the man's arm and using his momentum to send him crashing into a pile of crates. Another figure came at him from the side, but Jake was ready. He swung a heavy right hook, catching the man square in the jaw. The man staggered back, dazed, but before he could regain his balance, Jake delivered a quick uppercut, sending him sprawling to the floor. But Jake wasn't done. He couldn't afford to be. As the remaining men circled, Jake's eyes flickered to Emma, who was watching from the corner, her eyes wide with fear but determination. She didn't understand the full extent of what was going on, but she knew one thing. Jake wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. That thought fueled him. He couldn't fail her. He couldn't let the city fall into chaos. Stay back, Emma, Jake grunted, his voice hoarse. Stay out of this. It's not safe. But Emma didn't move. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Jake. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice firm. I'm not afraid. Jake's heart skipped. He wanted to argue, to tell her to run, but the look in her eyes made him pause. She wasn't just a scared kid anymore. She was part of this fight, part of everything he was trying to protect. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shield her from the truth. She was in this too. The remaining men hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure of what to do. They clearly weren't expecting Emma to stand her ground. For a moment, the tension in the room was palpable. Then the leader of the group, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. You really think you can protect her? He sneered. You think this little girl is going to save the day? You're just as deluded as everyone else. She's not just a little girl, Jake growled. His voice had lost all its calm, replaced with pure fury. She's stronger than you'll ever be. Without warning, the man lunged, but Jake was quicker. He dodged the attack, landing a solid blow to the man's midsection. The force of it sent the leader stumbling back. You'll never win. The man spat, his eyes flashing with hatred. You don't know what's coming. You don't know who you're up against. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man's words meant nothing to him. They were just distractions, ways to make him doubt himself, doubt everything he had been fighting for. But Jake wasn't going to fall for it. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The man came at him again, this time with a knife in hand, slashing toward Jake's face. But Jake was faster. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it, forcing the knife to drop. In a fluid motion, Jake knocked the man off balance and kicked him hard in the chest, sending him crashing into the nearby wall. The man slid to the floor, unconscious. Jake stood tall, his chest heaving with the effort, but he wasn't done yet. He couldn't stop now. The others were still standing, circling like sharks waiting for the right moment to strike. But Jake wasn't going to let them. Not when he had Emma to protect. Is that all you've got? Jake shouted, his voice echoing in the warehouse. Because I'm not done. He stepped forward, ready to face the rest of them, when suddenly the lights flickered. The whole warehouse seemed to tremble. A low rumble echoed through the walls, and for a moment, everything went still. Jake's heart skipped. Something was happening. Something big. He turned toward the door, his instincts telling him that they weren't alone. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A sound like a heavy engine revving in the distance reached his ears. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. The door to the warehouse burst open, and a new group of figures flooded into the room. They weren't like the others. They weren't here to fight. They were here to finish what had been started. Jake's stomach dropped as he recognized the insignia on their jackets. They were part of the same organization, the ones who had set this whole mess in motion. And they were here to make sure it ended the way they wanted. Emma looked up at Jake, her face pale, but her resolve stronger than ever. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady. Jake didn't answer right away. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping something that could destroy everything they knew. And he wasn't going to let that happen. "I'm not leaving," Jake said, his voice steady, but his insides were churning with uncertainty. The figures in front of him, new enemies, fresh threats, moved with precision, their presence filling the room like a storm waiting to break. They weren't here to negotiate. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. Emma stood behind him, her eyes wide, her small body pressed close to the shadows of the warehouse's corner. He didn't want her to see the fear in his eyes, but it was hard to hide it now. The stakes had just escalated to something far beyond their control. The sound of boots on concrete echoed around the large, dark room as the new group advanced. They weren't wearing the same gear as the earlier men. These were different, their movements more calculated, their faces covered by high-tech masks that made them appear even more intimidating. These weren't street thugs. These were professionals. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he assessed the situation. The door had just slammed open, and with it, the terrifying reality of their predicament sank in. The stakes weren't just personal anymore. This wasn't just a fight for survival. The city, his city, was hanging by a thread. "We need to get out of here," Emma whispered, her voice barely a tremble, but Jake could hear the fear there. She was scared, and he knew it. But Emma wasn't a child anymore. She understood the danger. She knew that there was no running from what had already been set in motion. Jake shook his head slightly, the determination in his eyes hardening. "Not yet," he said firmly. "We're not running anymore. We're standing our ground." One of the new men stepped forward, his movements smooth and controlled. He wasn't even looking at Jake directly. His gaze was focused on the large map of the city that was spread out across the wall in front of him. The same map Jake had seen earlier, the one that had been marked with red areas and symbols. The man didn't speak at first. Instead, he walked toward the map, pointing to one of the locations on it. "This is where it all ends," the man said, his voice calm. But there was a cold edge to it that made Jake's blood run cold. "We've already set everything in motion. You can't stop it now. You never could." Jake's jaw clenched. The man was talking about the plan. Whatever this was, whatever they were planning, it was coming. And the city was in their sights. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Jake growled, his body tense, preparing for another fight. The man turned to face him then, his eyes dark and unreadable behind the mask. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Jake," the man said. "And you're just another obstacle. Just like you always have been." There was no mistaking the cold finality in his voice. Jake had heard that tone before, from men who thought they were untouchable, who believed their power couldn't be challenged. The last time Jake had heard that voice, it had been in the dark corners of a motorcycle bar, when the Hells Angels were at their most dangerous. "I'm not afraid of you," Jake spat, stepping closer, his fists clenching. He didn't care anymore. These men, whatever their plan was, had to be stopped. "Now, you should be," the man said with a cold smile. "You're standing on the edge of something you don't understand. The moment you opened that container, you sealed your fate. There's no way out now. It's too late." Jake felt a surge of frustration, but he couldn't let that distract him. He couldn't afford to be intimidated. Not now. Not when the fate of the city was on the line. The man in front of him seemed to sense Jake's resolve, because his expression shifted, becoming more serious. "You want to stop this?" the man asked, his voice lowering. You're going to have to go through us. And we're not as easy to defeat as the rest. Jake didn't say anything at first. He couldn't afford to waste time talking. He needed to act. Without warning, he lunged forward, taking the man by surprise, slamming him into the nearby wall. The figure grunted, but Jake didn't give him the chance to recover. He landed a punch to the man's gut, forcing the air out of him. The man gasped for breath, but Jake wasn't done. He grabbed him by the collar and lifted him up, his eyes burning with fury. "Tell me what's going on," Jake demanded, his voice low and full of menace. The man only smiled, his eyes cold. "You really think I'll tell you anything?" he said. "You're too late to change anything. All you're doing now is delaying the inevitable." Jake was done listening. He threw the man aside, his muscles burning with exhaustion, but his resolve unwavering. "We'll see about that," Jake said, his voice dripping with anger. He turned to face the rest of the group, all of whom were watching him, their expressions unreadable. "You think you can just walk in here and finish what you started?" Jake said, stepping toward them. "Not without a fight." "That's what we're counting on," the leader said with a smirk. The sound of heavy footsteps came from the other side of the warehouse as another group of figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. These new figures were larger, more imposing, and they were carrying weapons. Jake's heart sank. It wasn't just these men. There was more coming. A whole lot more. And they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Jake turned to Emma, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to go? Now." Emma's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded quickly. She understood. They couldn't afford to stay. The fight wasn't over, but their best chance at survival was getting out of there, regrouping, and coming up with a plan. They had to stop whatever was happening before it was too late. They ran for the back of the warehouse, Jake taking Emma's hand and pulling her along. As they reached the back door, Jake glanced over his shoulder, seeing the group of men closing in behind them. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "I can't keep running like this," Jake muttered to himself, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. As he and Emma rushed through the back alley behind the warehouse, he glanced over his shoulder and saw the figures still pursuing them, their shadows cutting through the dim light as they closed in. The adrenaline was coursing through him, his body aching with every step, but there was no time to slow down. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. Emma, her small hand gripping his tightly, nodded without a word, her wide eyes reflecting the fear that gripped her. She had seen enough now to understand just how dangerous this was. They couldn't afford to let these men catch them. They couldn't afford to let them win. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling as they turned another corner, hoping the wet conditions would make it harder for the pursuers to keep up. Jake didn't care about the rain or the cold. All that mattered now was getting Emma to safety and stopping whatever had been set into motion. "Where are we going?" Emma asked, her voice small but filled with determination. "We need to find a place to lay low for now," Jake replied, glancing around quickly. "Somewhere we can think, regroup, and figure out our next move." They ran through the alleyways, Jake leading the way, trying to remember every shortcut he knew. His mind was a whirlwind of plans and possibilities, each more desperate than the last. They couldn't just keep running. The truth about the city's fate was out there, and it was connected to the container they had opened. He could feel it in his bones. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. And Jake wasn't going to let that happen. "Over there," Jake said, pointing to an old building at the end of the street. It was a rundown place, its windows boarded up, but it was the kind of spot where they could disappear for a while. They were just about to turn the corner when a sharp noise rang through the night, a metallic sound that made Jake freeze in his tracks. The unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine revving. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't have to look to know that the pursuers weren't far behind. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Jake!" Emma's voice cracked with fear. He pulled her close, his mind racing. He couldn't outrun them on foot, and he wasn't about to risk getting caught. They had to fight. "Stay here," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "I'll handle this." Before Emma could protest, Jake was already moving, ducking into the shadows of the building. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall, holding his breath as the motorcycle passed by. The rider slowed, scanning the alleyway, but Jake kept perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The motorcycle engine hummed just feet away from him, but the rider, clearly unaware of Jake's presence, continued on, heading down the street. Jake waited for what felt like an eternity before he exhaled sharply, his pulse still racing. He was alive. For now. He turned back to Emma, who was still standing in the shadows, her eyes wide with fear but relieved. "It's okay," Jake said, his voice steady now. "We're safe for the moment." He grabbed her hand again, leading her into the building. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, the walls covered in grime and dust, the floors cracked and uneven. But it was better than nothing. "We need to figure out what to do next," Jake said, pacing the floor. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "This isn't over. We're running out of time." "What do you mean?" Emma asked, her voice small but filled with concern. Jake stopped and looked at her, his heart heavy. "I mean, they're not going to stop. Whoever they are, whatever they're planning, it's going to happen. And we're the only ones who know. We're the only ones who can stop it." Emma's eyes widened, and she took a step forward, her small hand gripping Jake's sleeve. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked down at her, his chest tightening with the weight of the responsibility. She was just a kid. She shouldn't be caught up in this. But the truth was, she had been caught up in it from the moment they opened that container. "We need to find out who's behind this," Jake said, determination hardening his voice. "We need to find out what they want, and we need to stop them before it's too late." He ran a hand through his hair, trying to clear his thoughts. "I don't know who they are yet, but I'm sure they'll come for us again. And when they do, we'll be ready." There was a knock at the door, and Jake froze, his muscles tensing. Someone was here. He didn't know who, but he knew one thing. They weren't here for a friendly chat. He turned toward Emma, giving her a quick, reassuring nod. "Stay quiet," Jake said softly. He pulled his gun from his waistband and moved toward the door, his every sense on high alert. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Emma. Not now, not ever. Jake slowly turned the knob and opened the door just a crack, peering out into the dark. The figure standing outside was tall, cloaked in shadows. But as Jake's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw the unmistakable insignia on the man's jacket, the same symbol that had been on the map. He wasn't sure if this was a friend or an enemy, but either way, Jake knew this meeting was going to change everything. The figure outside the door didn't speak, but Jake's instincts told him this wasn't just another enemy. There was something different about the way the man stood, something almost familiar in his posture. Jake's hand was still on the door handle, his gun resting in the other, his muscles tight and ready for anything. But the stranger didn't make a move toward him. Instead, he stood still, waiting, watching. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice low, but his tension evident. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly stepped forward into the dim light of the alley, his face still partially obscured by shadows. But there was something in the way the man carried himself, the way he moved, that made Jake hesitate. This wasn't a typical thug or hired gun. This man wasn't here to fight. At least, not yet. The man's voice came slowly, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "You've been looking for answers," he said, his tone calm, even. "I can give you some of them." Jake's grip on the door tightened. He couldn't trust this man. Not yet. Not when so much was at stake. "I don't need answers from you," Jake growled. "I'm not interested in your game. I'm here to stop what you started." The man tilted his head slightly, as though amused by Jake's words. "You think you're the only one who can stop this?" he asked, his voice tinged with a dark, knowing amusement. "You're late to the party, Jake. Much later than you think." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. What did he mean? What was he talking about? He had to keep his focus. This man, whoever he was, wasn't just some random player. He was part of the same game, the same dark plot that had already thrown the city into chaos. And now Jake was caught in the middle. "Get to the point," Jake said, his voice hardening. "Why are you here?" The man stepped closer, just out of arm's reach, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace, but there was nothing peaceful about him. "I'm here to help you," he said simply. Jake's eyes narrowed. "Help me? You've got some nerve." The man shrugged, unfazed by Jake's growing anger. "You're going to need more than just your fists to take this down," he said. "You're in over your head, Jake. This isn't something you can solve with violence alone." Jake didn't like the sound of that. He didn't need help. He had handled worse than this. But as he looked at the man in front of him, he realized that he might be right. This was bigger than a street fight, bigger than anything he had ever faced. What exactly is it you want? Jake demanded. What's your play in all of this? The man's face remained impassive, but Jake could see the glint of something more in his eyes, something that told Jake he wasn't dealing with a typical enemy. I'm trying to stop it too, the man said, his voice surprisingly candid. I know who's behind all of this. But if you want to stop it, you'll need more than just brute force. You need to understand what you're up against. Jake clenched his fists, trying to control the anger bubbling inside of him. What do you know? He asked, his voice low. Who's pulling the strings here? The man hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke. You've heard of the syndicate, haven't you? Jake's blood ran cold. The syndicate. He had heard whispers about them, an underground organization with roots in every dark corner of the city, controlling everything from weapons trafficking to political influence. But he hadn't known they were connected to all of this. To the map, the container, the mysterious messages. They've been pulling the strings for years, the man continued. They control everything, the city's economy, its police, its politicians. And they've been planning something big, something that'll change everything. Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had suspected there was something more to this than just a fight over power. The syndicate was no small threat, and they were going to take everything down if they weren't stopped. What's their plan? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes flickered with something that almost looked like regret. That's the part one don't have the answers to, he said. But I know one thing. They've been using people like you and me to get what they want. And now, it's time to finish it. Jake's mind raced. He was right. They had been using him, using his past, his skills, to set the stage for something far bigger than he had realized. And now, it was coming to a head. So, what do you want from me? Jake asked. I want you to stop fighting, the man replied. I want you to take the fight to them. The syndicate isn't going to just give up. And if you keep doing this alone, they'll take you down. I've seen it happen too many times. Jake didn't trust him. Not yet. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever the syndicate was planning, he couldn't stop it on his own. I'm not doing this for you, Jake said, his voice hard. I'm doing this for the city. For the people who don't even know what's coming. The man nodded slowly. Good. Then we're on the same side. Jake didn't know if he believed that. But he also didn't have a choice. He needed answers. And this man was the only one who could give them to him. Where do we start? Jake asked. I'll take you to the heart of it, the man said. But know this, Jake. Once we go in, there's no turning back. Jake glanced over at Emma, who had been silent this whole time, watching them from the shadows. He wasn't sure if she understood just how dangerous things had gotten. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, he couldn't let her get hurt. Let's go, Jake said, his voice steady. We do this now, or it's all over. With that, they turned and walked deeper into the night, toward whatever awaited them, knowing that the fight for the city was only just beginning. The cold night air hit Jake's face as they approached the abandoned building, a place where everything had started to unravel. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the heart of the storm. The man who had guided them here hadn't said much since they left the warehouse, but the tension in the air was palpable. Emma, still by his side, looked up at him with wide, unsure eyes. He could see the weight of it all on her small face, the fear she tried so hard to hide. Jake squeezed her hand, reassuring her with a silent promise. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. The man ahead of them, whose face remained hidden by the shadows of his hood, stopped in front of the building's rusted doors. This is it, he said, his voice quiet, but with an authority that made Jake uneasy. Whatever you're looking for, it's behind these doors. But be prepared. Once you go in, there's no turning back. Jake didn't hesitate. He couldn't. The fate of the city was at stake, and they were the only ones who had any chance of stopping it. He nodded to the man, signaling that he was ready. The man reached for the door, his movements slow, deliberate. As the door creaked open, the sound echoed through the night, like the last warning before a storm broke. Jake and Emma followed closely behind, their footsteps heavy in the silence. The air inside was damp, the smell of old wood and mildew mixing with the faint, metallic scent of something Jake couldn't place. It felt like the kind of place where secrets were buried, and where everything that had led to this moment would finally come to light. The man led them down a narrow, dimly lit hallway. Each step seemed to take them deeper into the unknown. At the end of the hall, The man stopped and turned to face them. "You're about to learn the truth," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But be careful what you wish for. Some truths can destroy everything you've ever believed in." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm ready," he said, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. He wasn't sure what the truth would be, but he knew that he couldn't back down now. The man stepped aside, revealing a large room at the end of the hall. Inside, the walls were covered in maps, blueprints, and photographs. Everything they had been searching for, all laid out before them. But there was one thing that caught Jake's eye, a large monitor in the center of the room, displaying a live feed of the city's skyline. His heart sank. He knew instantly what it meant. The syndicate wasn't just planning something. They were already making their move. On the screen, Jake saw the familiar landmarks of the city, places he knew like the back of his hand. But there were red marks on the screen, flashing in time with the city's heartbeat. It was happening. Whatever it was happening now. The man stepped forward, his expression grim. "This is their plan," he said, pointing to the screen. "The syndicate has already activated their operation. The city is the target, and it's already too late to stop it." Jake felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. "What are they going to do?" he asked, his voice tight. The man's eyes flickered with something Jake couldn't quite read. "They've rigged the city's infrastructure to fall. The moment they push the button, everything you know will come crashing down. Power grids, communications, transportation, it'll all shut down. And when the city systems go dark, chaos will follow. They'll take control, and no one will be able to stop them." Jake's mind raced. This was bigger than he could have imagined. They weren't just after power or money. They were after control, complete control over everything. The syndicate had set everything in motion, and there was no way to reverse it. "How do we stop it?" Jake demanded. The man stepped closer, his face serious. "We don't stop it," he said. "We can only delay it. The only chance you have is to destroy their mainframe, the one running all of this. It's hidden somewhere in the city, but they've kept it well guarded." Jake's mind was racing. "And where is it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he really wanted to know. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned to the maps on the wall. "I can't give you the exact location," he said, "but I can give you a lead. There's a facility just outside the city. It's connected to their operation. If you can get there and destroy the mainframe, you might be able to stop them from launching the full-scale attack." Jake looked at Emma, who was standing silently by his side, watching everything unfold. He knew she didn't fully understand what was at stake, but he could see it in her eyes. The same determination that had been burning inside of him ever since this whole nightmare started. "We don't have much time," Jake said, turning to the man. "We need to move now." The man nodded. "Then go. You have your lead. But remember, this isn't over. Even if you stop them, there will always be more." Jake didn't respond. There was no time for words now. He grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the door. The city was on the brink of destruction, and they were the only ones who could stop it. He wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. As they stepped back into the cold night air, Jake felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He didn't know what was waiting for them at the facility, but he knew one thing. He would fight until the end. For Emma, for the city, for everything. In this thrilling continuation of the Hell Angel stories, Jake finds himself trapped in a dangerous game with mysterious enemies whose plans could destroy the entire city. As the tension rises, Jake is forced to confront his past and face an even greater threat than he expected. Alongside Emma, a young girl caught in the chaos, Jake must navigate the dark corners of the city to stop an unknown enemy from carrying out a devastating plan. With the fate of the city hanging in the balance, Jake discovers that the fight he's up against is not just about survival. It's about stopping an unstoppable force. This latest chapter in the Hell Angel stories takes the stakes higher than ever, as Jake races against time to uncover the truth and confronts forces that will stop at nothing to get what they want. Join Jake and Emma on their high-stakes mission, filled with unexpected twists and heart-pounding action in the latest of the Hell Angel stories, where danger lurks around every corner and the city's fate rests in the hands of those willing to fight. In this epic continuation of the Hell Angel stories, betrayal and secrets come to light, and only those brave enough to face the truth will survive. Get ready for a thrilling ride as the mystery unfolds and the heroes must stand strong against forces they never saw coming. If you're a fan of Hell Angel stories, you won't want to miss this intense chapter filled with action, suspense, and the relentless pursuit of justice.